Welcome back to the Iran Policy Podcast. In this episode, we will discuss the ongoing wave of protests in Iran and the future of the country. What makes this uprising different? How can it be sustained? Will it lead to a revolution? And if it does, what are the characteristics of a viable alternative to the current regime? What can we learn from past experiences in the region and in Iran? And of course, how can the international community support the Iranian people's quest for freedom and democracy? Joining us to discuss this and more is Senator Robert Torricelli, a longtime champion of the cause of freedom and democracy in Iran. Greetings, Senator. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to it.
So let me start the conversation with the several rounds of protests that we have seen in the past few years. Of course, you followed all of that. There's been several rounds of nationwide uprisings in Iran. And right now, there's an ongoing uprising that started in September. What makes it different this time? How do you see the future of this unprecedented wave of protests? And will it lead to a revolution, or will the regime succeed in quelling it?
I think it's best to answer your question from an historic perspective, and not necessarily Iranian history, but in the history of revolts against dictatorial and oppressive regimes generally. Because as many successful revolutions there have been unsuccessful revolutions. When revolutions fail, it is usually because they are either planned externally without popular support, or conversely, they are internal, spontaneous, but lack professional planning, execution, and leadership. What is unique about what's taking place in Iran now is that it has both the qualities of spontaneity internally, but also some professional leadership. And this, of course, is where the MEK plays a role. That its own revolutionary units internally have provided some guidance and planning, but the sentiment, the uprising, has been indigenous, obviously based on the conditions that generally cause revolution: oppression, injustice, poverty, and a long list of grievances. So I think those qualities provide the uniqueness of the moment.
Makes sense. And I think you mentioned in one of your recent speeches that this time the revolution cannot be stolen. And can you elaborate on that? So what does it mean to steal a revolution? And I guess you explained it a bit, but you might want to expand on that. And how can you prevent it? How can this resistance movement prevent it?
Of course, it's not unusual historically, and particularly in Iran, but generally, that popular uprisings, which cause the end of a despotic regime, are stolen by people who simply, their interests are at variance with the population itself. Cuba in 1959 had the makings of a democratic revolution, and it was stolen by a Marxist clique. And probably the best example in history is the 1979 revolution in Iran. That revolution, which was a popular uprising where people wanted an end to the Shah, but I think there's every reason to believe wanted not only an end to the despotic regime, but popular freedoms and pluralism, of course, was stolen by the mullahs. Those are far from the only two examples, but those are the two most popular examples in recent history.
Mm-hmm. And you also said that it cannot be stolen this time. So this is not a revolution that will be stolen. So how does that happen?
Well, I think largely because the experience of the Iranian people themselves. They saw a revolution stolen in 1979. They understand that it isn't simply ending one despotic regime. It is being sure that it is replaced by something that represents the desires of popular will. And I think simply because of the bitterness of what the mullahs did in stealing the 79 revolution, failing to have any democratic reforms, anything that would lead to a higher sustained standard of living, quality of life, popular expression, and pluralism. The Iranian people, if anyone has ever been on guard about a stolen revolution, it's the Iranian people right now. Mm-hmm. You can tell actually by the popular chants you see in the streets now in these demonstrations. No to the mullahs, no to the Shah. Neither alternative is acceptable.
And you just mentioned alternative, and I guess this is something that's always a point of consternation and in worry across the world, that once a regime falls, what is its alternative? What's going to replace it? So when it comes to Iran, or in general in the region, what are the characteristics of a viable alternative? And you mentioned the Iranian people have this experience with the 1979 revolution. They did not want the Shah regime, but what came after that was also not what they wanted. So what is a viable alternative? What are the characteristics that this alternative movement must have?
Well, I think actually looking at the experience of the MEK itself, which of course was part of the movement to end the Shah's regime, but immediately became a victim of the theocracy, which the Ayatollahs implemented in abandoning the revolution. So what grew out of the MEK being betrayed itself in the 1979 revolution, of course, is Mrs. Rajvi's 10-point plan. And then this time, the Iranian people have to simply not remove a dictator and bring in new leadership, but know firmly exactly what that new leadership is committed to do. That's why the 10-point plan, which talks about pluralism, an end to gender bias, state religion, a genuine representative democracy at peace with the world and its neighbors, with a prospect not only of civil liberties and rights, but also the conditions of an end to the poverty and economic growth, knowing exactly what a new regime would be for, in this case of the MEK, is so critical.
Makes sense. And I guess you mentioned at the beginning of your comments that this revolution has some of the characteristics that make it different. On the one hand, it has that spontaneous feeling to it, which is, you see that spark that happens with a single event. So in this time, it was a young girl who was killed by the morality police. But at the same time, you've seen this momentum being built up throughout the decades. So how has this revolution been in the making for like the past 4 decades? And how have the Iranian people been building up that momentum that we're seeing unfold in the streets today?
You know, I don't think that any regime falls because of a single injustice or a single moment. It's cumulative and it builds. Probably everything that Iranian students and workers and families are doing on the streets today, in demonstrating or writing slogans or refusing to work or to support the regime, people would have done individually before. It gets to a critical mass where people gain strength from each other. They recognize they're not alone, they're not the only ones, and that collectively their power is greater than the regime. That's what happened with the Shah. That's what happened with the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the American Revolution, the Cuban Revolution. This has happened thousands of times in history. It just gets to a point where people aren't afraid anymore. The fact is that hundreds of thousands of Iranians on the streets of Iranian cities are more powerful than Revolutionary Guards. They're more powerful than the police. They're more powerful than the mullahs, and there's nothing the regime can do about them. You can jail individuals, you can fire at individuals, but people finally get to the point where they just say, we're not taking it anymore, and there's nothing more powerful. There's nothing the regime can do.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if we really look back at this 4-decade history, at the same time, we've seen this movement that has been setting an example of not surrendering to the tyranny of the regime, despite the odds, despite everything that has happened. How do you see that history of the sacrifices that the Iranian resistance has made, all these people who have laid down their lives? How has that helped this movement sustain itself and overcome the odds that we're seeing today?
Everybody has their own motivation when they make this kind of sacrifice, and it's always different. I am sure many of these students, as much as they are motivated by the injustice, recognizing the sacrifice of others, it's intensely personal. Imagine that you grow up in poverty, you see the world getting more prosperous every day, students in Europe and North America and Asia gaining opportunities, living good lives. You study hard, you go to school, you have ambitions, you work hard, and then you leave school into poverty. No opportunities, no way to use your skills, no way to gain a future, no way to do something for your own children. Imagine you're a worker who works every day and works hard and sacrifices, but you still can't feed your families. You can't get any security. Everybody's motivation is different, and that can include brothers and sisters who've seen members of their families jailed, murdered by the regime, beaten in the streets, mothers and fathers who have lost all hope that their children have any future. It's all different, but on the streets it comes together. Everybody's there for a different reason, but everybody has the same motivation: ending it, making the future better than the past. In that, they come together. It doesn't matter that their motivations are different. What matters is they're united in one thing: the mullah's regime ends. And with that, Iran joins the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me switch to a slightly different topic. At the same time that we've seen these protests inside Iran, the Iranian diaspora have become very active in recent months. They've held large rallies and expressed their support for the ongoing protests in different ways across the world. And this is a good thing. But at the same time, we're seeing some people promote the idea that what the Iranian people want is a return to the rule of the monarchy, of the Shah. Why is that not an option?
The prospect of a rule of the Shah is a tool for the regime. The regime offers the false choice that you have the repressiveness of the moment with the mullahs, or you have a return to the Shah. That's not the choice. The choice is ending the mullahs and creating a pluralist democracy, as is so much of the world enjoys. Those who are promoting the return of the Shah are doing nothing but propping up the current regime. It's a false choice.
So absolutely. So it's really, it shouldn't be between like bad and worse, or between two dictatorships of different colors. It should be.
Well, not only that it shouldn't be, it isn't. There is no viable support for the Shah. There may be a few people who fled to Iran in the revolution with millions of dollars of stolen Iranian money hiding out, who dream of a return. But I mean, you can count them in the hundreds, not the thousands. They have no legitimacy. They have no right to return. They're largely criminals in hiding. They're not viable. They don't offer a future. They couldn't govern the country. They couldn't run a revolution. It is an irony of history. Those thieves hiding out around the world with their stolen money from the Shah's regime now are just tools for the mullahs to use to scare people about an end of their own regime. The people on the streets have it right. It's no to the mullahs and it's no to the Shah. This is a popular revolution to bring a pluralist democracy with genuine human rights to the Iranian people.
Absolutely. So now we're also seeing in recent months these calls for creating these big coalitions and alternatives, but by putting aside differences on fundamental issues such as the form of government, government structure, rights of minorities, women's rights, and so on. And so the argument is that if we put aside all of these things and agree on very vague terms today, we can defer everything to after the regime is overthrown. So why is that not an option? And why do we need to have a concrete platform such as the 10-point plan of Mrs. Rajavi while we continue to struggle to topple the regime?
Well, this isn't my country. This isn't America. This is Iran. But if it were my country, I wouldn't overthrow a despot without knowing what I was getting. And you've been there. You did that. You overthrew the Shah and you got the mullahs. You went from bad to worse. I think popular revolutions that succeed, like in my own country, when you start with a Declaration of Independence, you lay out for people, if you're going to sacrifice, if you're going to risk your lives, you're going to overthrow the government, here's what you're getting. And of course, that's what Mrs. Rajavi has done. Put it on the table. We end the mullahs, and we're going to restore, as the 10-point plan suggests, we're going to create a pluralist democracy. Women don't have to wonder whether or not they'll get equality. They will get equality. The people don't have to wonder whether they get representation. They will choose their own government. There will be general enfranchisement for voting. The people know what they're going to get. We're not going to get a regime which hangs people in the public square for another regime that will do the same. We are going to respect rights. We're going to have genuine trials where people's rights are protected. We're not going to take the money that should be going to investing in industry and jobs on a nuclear program that consumes billions of dollars to put Iran at risk with its neighbors. We're going to end it with the non-nuclear Iran. The 10-point plan is the future, and people should be able to go into the streets to create a popular uprising, knowing exactly what they're fighting for.
Absolutely. And so my final question for you is that while removing this regime change is the responsibility of the people of Iran and the resistance movement, the organized resistance movement, it's the resistance units, it's the MEK, it's the NCRI, and the whole family of the Iranian resistance. But at the same time, how can the international community stand by the side of the Iranian people? How can it help?
Well, first, I believe because the MEK is the only organization with resources and leadership and a willingness to sacrifice and organize, and every revolution needs to organize around someone and something and some set of beliefs, as I have outlined. This coalition also has to be broad. And I don't think it's an issue of when did you come to the revolution. It doesn't matter. If you're coming now, if you're coming tomorrow, if you came yesterday, if you've been fighting since 1979, it doesn't matter. There's room for everybody, and everybody should come without prejudice. I think the only thing that's important is that you are committed to a pluralist democracy along the lines of the 10-point plan. We don't need the Shah. We don't need a Marxist dictatorship. We don't need a different mullah. We're not going to change one dictatorship for another dictatorship. I think there's room for everybody as long as they're committed to a pluralist democracy.
Absolutely. And in terms of what the international community, in terms of like what states can do to help this revolution, what is their role?
I think that's an important question. There will always be governments, there'll always be people who will seek to profit from the moment. Iran has rich resources, and there are people who will put aside the interests of Iran, the Iranian people, the international community for human rights to profit by the moment. I understand that will always happen. But you asked me what the international community can do. Be true to itself. Fight for the Iranian people what you'd want for your own people. My government has chosen not to trade with Iran, not to recognize its government, not to seek profit by the moment, but to stand with the long-term interest of the Iranian people. Some in Europe have done the same. There are others who would put aside the human rights of the Iranian people and its aspirations for the future to gain profit for the moment by selling arms or buying oil or other minerals or whatever it may be. I think that's a shame. And I think in time they'll be embarrassed by it. They'll wish they didn't, but that's human nature, unfortunately. My country's chosen a different path, and we're not alone. It's time to end this dictatorship and bring a new freedom and a new opportunity and prosperity to the Iranian people.
Absolutely. So it was a very insightful conversation, Senator. It was very nice having you on the program.
Enjoyed it.
Of course, we hope to have you with us again in the future. Have a good day.
Thank you.